Welcome to Gambling with an Edge with your hosts Bob Dancer and Richard Munchkin. Bob Dancer is America's premier video poker writer and teacher. He's written 10 books, including Video Poker for the Intelligent Beginner and the best-selling $1 Million Video Poker. He helped develop the computer software Video Poker for Winners, and in 2004 he was inducted into the Video Poker Hall of Fame. Richard Munchkin has been a professional advantage player for over 30 years and is in the Blackjack Hall of Fame. His book, Gambling Wizards, Conversations with the World's Greatest Gamblers, is a testament to the many ways you can succeed at gambling. The goal of the show is that you'll be a more knowledgeable gambler tomorrow than you were yesterday. And now, here are Bob and Richard.
Good evening. Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. I'm Bob Dancer.
And I'm Richard Munchkin.
Our primary guest tonight is Mark Billings, author of Ultimate Edge, Professional Blackjack in the 1980s. We'll be speaking to Mark in a few minutes. But we also have a brief guest, Craig Cavalier, who's going to be speaking about a football stadium project on the UNLV campus, which in the recent past seems to have fallen apart. In the past week, there was criminal news from Kansas City that might affect several listeners. A gambler, we'll call him Joe, won a reported $700,000 from the Ameristar Casino, but over a period of months, gradually cashed out his winnings in chunks of cash less than $10,000 at a time, hence avoiding CTRs, which means currency transaction reports. For some reason, this is a felony, and it's called structuring. This is not a minor misdemeanor. Joe potentially faces up to 10 years in prison and a fine of $500,000. What do you know about this, Richard?
Well, what I know is, as usual, the newspapers got it all wrong. He was arrested. The newspapers said he won $700,000 over a period of many months. Yes, he had $700,000 in winnings and $400,000 in losses. So the actual figure of his win was less than half of what they reported. But yeah, he was arrested for structuring. He did not want the casino to know his name. So if you cash out over $10,000, you have to give them your name, and they fill out a cash transaction report. He didn't want them to know his name. He knew that once they knew his name, he was not going to be able to play anymore. But still, he's breaking the law by doing that. So, so he was arrested, and, he's got a lot of lawyers' fees ahead of him, and I really wish him luck. The newspapers also, one newspaper actually put his picture in there and listed him as Tommy Highland, which is completely ridiculous. I mean, they put the wrong name on the picture, so. But
Tommy Highland does own a blackjack team, and Joe might have been associated with that at least at one time.
Yeah.
And the purpose behind structuring, or the purpose behind these CTRs, is it primarily to prevent money laundering and drug money? Is that the idea behind it? And now they use it for everything, or what? Yeah,
that's exactly right. And they've gotten into the business of confiscating people's money. So it's very difficult to deal in a lot of cash these days. But the important thing for people to know is just don't do it. Don't break the law. It's one thing to mess with casinos, but you do not want to mess with the federal government.
They sometimes have no sense of humor. All right. We do have some time for a cute story. I regularly read the website richardmunchkin.com, and this past week there were a bunch of short items, although they were all published on April Fool's Day, so I'm a bit suspicious. But there was one of the stories about Richard's brother Jake being asked if he was a card counter 30 years ago. What happened, Munch?
So Jake was playing at the Tropicana. He was betting quarters, and there was another guy on the table betting black chips. And the shift manager had come over to talk to this known high roller that was sitting on the game. And at one point, he just turned and looked at my brother, and he said, "Are you a card counter?" My brother said, "No, why?" He goes, "Well, those guys over there," and he points at the other pit bosses and said, "Those guys think you're a card counter." My brother says, "Well, why would they think that?" He goes, "I don't know. I'll go ask them." So he goes over to the other bosses, and he comes back, and he's got a Griffin flyer with a picture of Jake on it. And now Jake is not a nondescript guy. Think Santa Claus before his hair went gray, at least at that time. And he holds up the picture and he says, well, they think this is you. And Jake looks at it and he goes, well, yeah, that looks like me, but that's not me.
Jake's a liar. Go ahead.
And so he shows it to the other high roller and he says, what do you think? And the guy goes, that looks like you. And Jake said, well, yeah, I agree. It looks like me, but it's not me. So he says, the shift manager says, do you swear you're not a card counter? Jake says, yeah, I swear. He goes, stand up and raise your right hand. So Jake stands up, raises his right hand, and the guy says, repeat after me. I swear I'm not a card counter. Jake says, I swear I'm not a card counter. And the shift boss goes, good enough for me, and walks away. So now it just so happened that one of my teammates was in the Tropicana and witnessed this going on and came rushing back to the house saying, you're not going to believe what just happened to your brother. So, Jake, what can he do? He knows he's not going to be able to sit there and win any more money at that point, So he played a few obligatory hands and then got up and cashed out. So,
but how often has he had to swear on? Did they bring out a Bible to swear on?
No Bible, and that's that's the only case I know of people having to swear they weren't card counters. That's the only case I'm aware of.
And it's an interesting standard of proof that that may not be good at all the times. All right. So we've been, what we're going to do is Craig Cavalier has not called in yet. We're expecting him momentarily. So we're briefly going to start with the Mark Billings interview. And we're going to ask Mark a few questions. And when then Craig calls in, we're going to switch bases back and forth, let Craig on for about 8-10 minutes, and then we're going to go back to Mark. So that's basically how we're going to do this. Mark Billings was a guest on our show a few months ago talking about biased roulette wheels. Since we didn't get tired of him then, we invited him back tonight to speak about his book, The Ultimate Edge, Playing Professional Blackjack in the 1980s. The book basically follows a small number of dedicated players as they devise and execute schemes to beat blackjack games all over the world found in the 1980s. Some of these schemes use computers. They were primitive by today's standards, but good enough to get the job done back then. Some of these players were backroomed and beaten up by casino goons. Fortunately, that has for the most part ended today, at least in the United States, thanks to lawyers like Bob Nersessian, among others. Mark Billings, welcome to Gambling with an Edge.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Mark, the book reads like a novel, and I'm sure the players' names were changed, but it also seems to be based on fact. As an author, you have a mysterious relationship with the characters in the book. In one scene, you appear out of nowhere and lose a push-up bet with Tony. And if any listeners don't know what I'm talking about, read my blog for this week. You'll enjoy it. That part of the book changed my life. At the end of the book, Tony submits a manuscript of what may actually be this book called The Ultimate Edge. So, are you Tony? What's the relationship between you and the book?
What happened was, over the course of the years that I was playing, or we were playing, players would kind of come and go. I'd have some teammates. Some people would leave. Some other people would come. And so early versions of the manuscript actually had the individual players. There were about 10 or 11 different people kind of coming and going. And I realized that it was getting a little bit confusing keeping track of who was who. And it was kind of getting in the way of the story. I mean, the story is really the important thing and what we did over the course of that time period. So the characters in the books are actually composites. So there's a character named Reed, but there's really 3 or 4 people who did the kinds of things that the character Reed in the book did. We did everything, but I just kind of assigned certain things to certain people. I actually left the authorship a little bit ambiguous. I did that on purpose because I kind of liked the idea that there was a character who only could write in a writing style that he had just read at one point. And the part of the book that you alluded to, what happened was he had just read Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and so that's where that chapter came from. I really liked that book very, very much. And so one chapter is written in that style. And then I think the takeaway is that the book may have been written by Tony, but he wrote it in the way in which Mark would have written the book.
And you were one of those parts of a composite of something.
I was, yes.
All right.
Or more than one.
Or more than one, yes.
One of the features you talked about is called slicing and dicing. What is that?
Yes, back, again, this is a number of years ago, but this was, mid-'80s, and there were the occasional dealer who would actually show the bottom card. And back then, most of the games were hand-cut. That doesn't exist anymore, and so, this can no longer be done. But the idea was, if you could see that bottom card and you were very accurate in the way you cut, you could actually cut that bottom card to the dealer if it was a small card, or cut the card to a big P, a big player, the player betting the money, if it was either a 10 or an ace. And so it did require quite a bit of practice. It required at least 3 people at the table, and it required a lot of signaling. It required so much signaling, as a matter of fact, that we actually had to come up with a signal that indicated the next thing I do is not a signal.
Because you might want to scratch your nose or something?
Exactly. If you want to scratch your nose, everybody would go crazy at the table because they couldn't figure out what you were saying.
Actually, we currently have a signal that means exactly that. What I just did was not a signal, because we often are scratching our heads, going, "Did you just say something?" And
exactly.
No.
Yeah. What precipitated it was there was a dealer who was, again, this was a long time ago, so I thought that I could actually get her whole card from the side. So I started moving to the right toward the pit, and every time I did it, one of the players was sticking his finger in his ear, which of course meant no. And so I stopped moving, and then I tried it again, and he did it again, and it turned out he was just scratching his ear. So we had to come up with the old, look, I'm just scratching my ear.
Finger in ear is better than certain other.
Yeah, it could. Yeah. Well, you probably saw that part too. There was another. Yeah.
I remember when interviewing Al Francesco, he had actually cut his fingernail to a specific length to aid him in cutting an exact number of cards when you could still, in the old days, cut by hand. So those games were very lucrative back then.
They were indeed.
Computers strapped to your leg. Can't do that anymore. You guys did that. So one of the things you did was shuffle tracking using this. How does this work, or how did this work?
What happened was, and I wasn't the only one to think of this, there's actually a number of people came up with this idea at roughly the same time, and I can tell you how I came up with it, and telling you how I came up with it will probably explain pretty much how it works. I was playing at the Sands. I understand the Sands is no longer with us. It was a 4-deck game, and the count just went up and up and up, and I kept raising my bet rate. And at the time, I didn't have a very big bankroll, so I made some of the biggest bets I'd ever made in my life. And what happened was we got to the cut card, which means it was a 4-deck game. They stopped dealing, of course, and the count was still plus 20. And so I just stared at the cards. When the dealer took the cards out of the shoe to shuffle, I just stared at those cards that she pulled out of the shoe, which of course had 10 extra 10s and aces in it. And I just thought, if I could only play that packet. And then I thought, well, maybe I can follow where that packet's going to go. But the problem is I would have no idea the cards with which those cards are going to get mixed up, and maybe they would just get mixed up with a bunch of little cards, and then all the 10s and aces would be diluted away, and that's kind of what did it. And so you can understand the idea is to try to track clumps of cards through the shuffle. And back in those days, the shuffles very often were very, very simple, fairly readily trackable shuffle, so you can actually see, okay, these are the cards that went into the discard rack in this order. They took them out and they shuffled them in a certain way, and so here are the clumps of cards that got mixed in with these other clumps of cards, and here's where you have a nice chunk of cards, maybe a 50 or a 60 card clump that consists of more 10s and aces than they should. And the great thing about that was, of course, back then people were starting to realize what card counting was, and even though most people, pit bosses, dealers, and so forth, couldn't actually count, it was very, very easy for them to know what to look for, right? Look for some guy, probably young, betting small, and then all of a sudden, 2/3 of the way through the deck or whatever, he just starts betting big. So what we realized was if we could bet big off the top, we would immediately allay any suspicions that we were doing anything. And that's what shuffle tracking, one of the things it allowed us to do was track the cards through the shuffle and then put the cut card in a position so that a nice clump of tens and aces we could cut to the front and bet big off the top of the deck.
So you mentioned that the shuffles were very easy back then, and because of that, the card counting community was very small back then. So a lot of people were really kind of discovering this at the same time, and a lot of people were making the same discoveries. And one of them I noticed in the book, I think something that every person who's attempted shuffle tracking kind of learns naturally is something you call the lean. You want to describe that?
Yeah. What happened? It's interesting that you actually did that too. We talked about this a little bit earlier. When you shuffle track, one of the things that you want to do is get the cut. You want to get the cut because that way you're the one who can put the cut card in the right place to either cut a nice clump of tens and aces to the front, or in another variation, cut the worst cards to the back, and that way you can actually play through an entire shoe without ever changing your bets, right? But in order to do that, you have to get the cut. I mean, you're the only one at the table who knows where to put that card. And what we recognized fairly early on is you can't, really go for the cut. You can't act like you really want it because the dealer will go right past you. So what you kind of do is just kind of lean forward a little bit, and you can actually get the cut more often than you really should.
Sometimes if you extend your hand as if you're accepting the cut card as you lean forward, too, the dealer's just so... And another trick I found was to ask them a question as they were finishing up the shuffle. So as they're answering the question, they're naturally looking at you, and you lean forward, and they just sort of automatically hand you the cut card.
Yep,
So
that's right. The other thing that we learned is once we started to play with a big player, a player betting the big money, the dealers will preferentially let that person I almost said preferentially shuffle, preferentially cut anyway, because after all they're betting, they're out betting often the entire pit, certainly the entire table, and so they really want to make that person happy. So often when we had a big better, he would get the cut, and of course then we had to come up with some signals to let him know where the cut card needed to go.
I was mentioning that the card counting community was really small back then. There were only two places to play, Nevada and Atlantic City. That was it. There were no other casinos. So
in the United States.
In the United States, right. So really, it seemed like all the card counting teams really kind of knew each other. And it also seemed like everybody, when they first moved to town, moved to the Twain and Swenson area, which is sort of a ghetto now. And when I first read the book, I was reading the book, and I was like, oh, my God, I know these guys. They lived right behind me, over in the Twain and Swenson area. So I just really enjoyed the book because it brought back so many memories of that time. And really, we were doing exactly the same thing,
Yeah, it really is amazing. And one of the nice things that happened was, I know you read the book, and you called somebody who
one of your teammates
played with,
yeah.
And you said, I think you might want to read this book. I think you're in it. And in fact, he was. And what he did was he wrote me a nice review on Amazon.com about the book, and we got back in touch after many, many years. And so we've seen each other quite a bit since then. So that was a lot of nice outcomes. I'm very pleased that I went ahead with the book. It's a long process, and I had rewritten it a number of times, and I wasn't really sure if I would ever, get it published or whatever. But what happened was a couple of people found some manuscripts, non-gamblers, found the manuscript laying around, and it wasn't complete, and they were begging me they said, where's the rest? Where's the rest? And I haven't written it. Well, you got to tell me what happened. So that's when I kind of realized that it might have a broader application than just a few gamblers that I know.
Now, in the book, you emphasize strongly that winning players need to keep secrets about the way they do things. Now, several authors, certainly including me in Video Poker, have shared our secrets, and as a result, casinos have tightened up. Ironically, in this book, you share several secrets while simultaneously saying it would be better if you didn't. So what caused you to change your position on that subject?
Everything that I write about in the book, and there's a number of things, we can kind of go over them a little bit if you like, but there's counting, of course, which you can still do, but everybody kind of knows how counting works by now, certainly after the movies and the articles and the books and so forth. There was something called front loading. There's something called spook. Front loading is looking at getting the dealer's whole card. Spooking is getting the dealer's whole card in a different way. The slicing and dicing, the tracking, none of these things are really possible anymore. And so that's why I really thought it was fair to kind of talk about it, because these things are sort of, just as one example, the spooking. What spooking was back then, if the dealer had a 10 up, actually an ace up as well, but it was mostly for 10s, they would bend the way it works is in Blackjack there's a down card and then there's a card on top of the down card. And if the up card was a 10, they would bend both the down card and the up card up and peek underneath it to see if there was an ace down there. Because, of course, if there is an ace down there, it means the dealer has the blackjack, flip it up, take everybody's money, and get on to the next hand. More hands per hour for the casino. There's no reason to wait around, have everybody play their hand, double down, split, all this kind of stuff. And then it turns out, oh my goodness, the dealer has a blackjack anyway, take everybody's money and forget that the round ever took place. That, in fact, is how they do it in Atlantic City. They actually have a hold card, but they don't look at it. Well, nowadays, or at least back then, that's how it worked.
Yeah, now they all have automatic peekers.
Right,
yeah.
now, and they have the peekers because of us, people like us.
Yeah. Actually, it was a guy named Howard Grossman who was a failed hole card player who went to work for the casinos and basically explained it to all the casinos and said, you have to stop this and we have to,
Yeah. Some people have no conscience.
And actually, almost all the concepts are still alive today, but they've all been written about enough that people are well aware of them. So
you see this as a history book, not as exploiting anything, not any current secrets.
That's exactly right. This is really what we did.
And also, a number of the things that were legal back then are no longer legal. So, playing with computers back then was perfectly fine.
Yeah, until July 1985, Black Tuesday or whatever it was.
Right, yeah.
Now, on the shuffle tracking computers that you would strap to your legs and you'd use your toes to input various kinds of things, the size of packets, etc., it took practice to get good at using your toes to input the data. Now, there's one incident in the book you talked about where the guy has a red light, green light machine in order to help practice. I think that's an interesting story. Why don't you share it with us?
Sure. What happened was we had these little computers that we built. They ran at 1 megahertz. They had 30K of memory. 30K, not 30 megabytes, not 30 gigabytes. They had 30K, and it was extraordinary. We thought, well, how are we going to use this up? It was terrific. And so... And we had built our own shoes, and the shoes only had 2 buttons. There was 1 button in the right shoe and 1 button in the left shoe. And since we needed about, 16 or 17 different commands, what we did was we had overlapping button commands. So, for example, of course, we could have a left, we could have a right. We could have a left down, hold it down, and right. We could have a right down, hold it down while you push the left down. We had a right, hold it down, left, right. Left, right, all these different, series of commands with only 2 buttons. And it was not that easy to learn how to do. So one of the individuals who was an investor in the team had a friend who lived in Chicago, and he really wanted him to be on the team. So what we did was we sent him the instructions, right, in the manual and said, here's all the inputs that you need to learn. So while his wife drove from Chicago to Las Vegas, he sat in the passenger seat of the car, and he had made this little kind of electronic circuit and made a pair of shoes. And what happened was the right button was connected to a red light, and the left button was connected to a green light. And so what he did was he would sit in the car, and he could actually hold the buttons or the lights in his hand, and he could make sure that, let's say it was a right, left, right, he could make sure that the red light came on, and then the green light would come on, go off, and then the red light would go off, and then he would know that he'd overlapped properly, right? So after a couple of days, driving, he had the commands down. So he rolled up his buttons and he rolled up his wires with the lights and he stuck them in the corner of his suitcase, and that was pretty much the end of the lights. Except, unfortunately, we played at the Desert Inn. And I can get into this a little bit if you like, but we wound up getting a little bit of heat, and the security guards came to the room, which was a problem. And they searched the room, and they found the lights. They found the wires.
A cheating device.
Right, exactly right. And we made it on TV and everything. And what the guy explained was, and by the way, we had lost quite a bit of money on this play. And so this was, and we all watched this on television, by the way. And so the guy gets on TV and he explains what we were doing, and he says,
The guy, you mean a gaming agent?
I'm sorry, right? It was a gaming agent. I'm sorry about that, right? So
Yeah.
it was a gaming agent on TV explaining what this group of cheaters was doing. And what this group of cheaters was doing apparently was the following: they had a woman who would bet at one end of the pit, betting large amounts of money and losing on purpose to take away the attention of the pit boss, while at the other end of the pit, these spookers were at work. These are guys who were getting the whole card from being behind the dealer and looking. Remember how I explained how they used to bend the 10 up so they would see if there was an ace down there. And the red and green lights was the signal to the better.
That's a good subtle signal. Nobody would ever catch that one.
Right.
Nobody would see that.
So red light meant stand and green light meant hit. And fortunately, before too much money was lost, these cheaters were thwarted by the Desert Inn. It's incredible that I'm talking about all these places that literally don't even exist anymore. It's kind of sad.
Now, do you think this guy actually believed this nonsense that he was saying on TV?
I guess I'll never know. I guess I'll never know.
You know, it should be pointed out back then, really you think in the book, and I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, that the reason you got pulled up was because somebody made a phone call from the phone in the room. And this was really common for the casinos to listen in on your phone calls when they were suspicious of people in the hotels.
Yeah, that's almost certainly that's what precipitated the security coming to the room, was that because, we had told everybody, well, first of all, we were reluctant to even take a room in the first place. And I know that,
Take a room in the hotel you were playing.
Yeah. And what happened was we had an investor at this time who had a lot of experience with betting large amounts of money, big money plays. And he said, no, it would look odd if you had somebody betting this much money not take advantage of the comps. The comp system was very different back then too. It was instead of having points and cards and stuff like that, it was just the pit bosses could just make up their minds and say, here you go. And we had the room was incredible. The room had 5 bedrooms and its own pool. It was really incredible. It was quite an operation, right? So, and we were very, very clear. Don't use the phone in the room. But he just wouldn't. He just refused to go across the street and use a payphone. And so that's almost certainly what precipitated it. And it was really bad because we had this fantastic system. We were down quite a bit. And
that's that woman's fault on the other side of the pit.
Yeah, you see what happened? Yeah, losing all that money on purpose.
Also back then we had incidents where they would go into safe deposit boxes. You have a safe deposit box that supposedly you have the only key, there in the hotel, and they would go in and look at the contents of safe deposit boxes.
Amazing.
And
I never heard that. That's amazing.
I know.
Yeah.
It can't be any kind of legal.
I know back then Tommy's team had their goal every year was to get through the entire year without their team manual being stolen by one of the casinos, because they would always tell their players, do not take this to your room. And every year somebody would get busted and they would get Tommy's team manual. So,
yeah, there's another. I can add a little bit to that. We actually had the shuffle tracking computer was sufficiently complicated that we actually did have a manual for that. And the very first page said, do not let this fall into any hands. Do not leave this in your room. Do not leave this out anywhere. And tear out this page and throw it away. And I guess I don't have to tell you what happened.
Right. Now, you were talking about the shoes, and, people sometimes don't realize how small a town Las Vegas is. And so you had an incident where a guy he took the smart approach. He was going to go have a real cobbler make his shoes for him, right? So tell us that story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The rest of us, we were kind of poor, struggling blackjack players. So we went to Gemco, or we went to, whatever existed at the time. We just needed shoes with big toes. And then we would take our Dremel motor tool out with a saw, and we would saw them open and put the toes, put the buttons in the toes and glue them back together. And they, admittedly, especially at this remove, they look terrible. I must admit, they didn't look very good. So this guy had this idea that he would have some shoes made professionally. He would go to a cobbler and actually have the shoes built properly. And so he walked in, and he kind of explained what he needed, and there was an attractive woman in the shoe shop, and so he kind of in an attempt to impress her, I guess, he kind of told her, what was going on here and how these shoes were going to, make all this kind of money and stuff like that. And so a couple of weeks later, when he went back to pick up the shoes, there was clearly something wrong. There was kind of a stakeout going on at the cobbler shop. And so fortunately for him, he didn't actually go pick them up. He realized that there was something wrong. But unfortunately, we actually had players at the time in Europe. I was over there at the time, and so were a couple of actually 4 of us were over there. And Griffin put out a sheet and said, watch out for these, watch out, there's something going. They didn't know what it was exactly, but they knew there was something going on with shoes at this point. And it actually made it to England. And one of the players was actually barred at a club in England only because of the result. They didn't know what he was doing. They didn't know that it was tracking. They didn't know what they were for, but they did know that something was going on with his shoes.
Huh. And the pretty girl, there was some connection between her.
Oh,
and...
that's right. I forgot to tell you. It turned out that she worked at the Aladdin, another casino that no longer exists.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, she worked at the Aladdin, so she told her boss, who told whoever, and away it went.
Actually, I have to tell my shoe story.
Go ahead.
So we were building communication equipment into tennis shoes because they have the thick rubber, and it was very small, just some batteries on each side, and you had to send and receive, and it would buzz in your feet, and we were just using it to communicate with each other in the casinos. This was all before the law changed. So anyway, we would get these big New Balance shoes and the X-Acto knives, and we're trying to carve out these little holes, and the whole thing fit under the sole, so you could look in the shoe, everything looked great. But anyway, we're making the thing, and one of my teammates has got his X-Acto knife in that rubber, and he's pulling, and he pulls it, and it jerks, and he stabs himself right in the sternum with the X-Acto knife. Fortunately, he hit the sternum, right, and got stopped by the bone, right? So now he's got this X-Acto knife sticking out of his chest, right? And we're like, wow, we have to go. We got to play that we're supposed to be at the marina, you know?
Forget about emergency room. We got to play.
No, and he said, you guys got to take me to the hospital. And we were like, no, but we got to go play. The dealer's coming on. He's like, I'm stabbed. And we're like, yeah, it's not bleeding much. You can drive. And, he insisted that we drive him to the emergency room. And literally, I think we just dropped him off at the door of the emergency room and went on to the play. He never has let us forget that either. He still thinks we did the wrong thing.
I'll bet. And I can see, having done the shoes, I can see that happening because they're very, very tough to cut open.
Yeah.
We actually come up with a really, really good method ultimately to do these things. It's much, much better. The idea was that we just took a regular shoe and we cut out a hole in the existing sole. And then we went to a shoemaker and had him put a brand new sole on that actually had the button already glued on it. And they're beautiful. You can't tell anything at all. They're really good, yeah.
The title of your book is called Ultimate Edge, which is a particular technique you were using near the end of your run. Basically, how did that work?
The Ultimate Edge was a little method that we came up with it basically won virtually every hand that we played. And it was a little bit complicated, but the short version of a fairly long story is we had a van outside, and we had somebody inside with a camera, and another person inside who would, and again, this was done with a hand-cut game, which of course this no longer exists, who would just riffle the cards. And a little bit of a riffle would get caught on the camera, and we would play it back. And so we would basically know the exact sequence of cards that were going to come out.
They would riffle the cards as they were cutting them by hand.
Yes.
So that's
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, it was a hand cut only, and we do a little bit of a riffle, and then the signal would go out. They would play it back on this big clunky video recorder, and punch the cards into a little computer, and then the computer would spit out a strategy that you could play that would ensure that you would win every hand.
But this had to be a perfect riffle.
Yes.
So each one card at a time. If they ever got two cards in there together, that would throw you off completely.
Yes, and it had to be nice and even. And you're right. That's exactly right. Any little hiccup, and it wouldn't work anymore.
Actually, about a year ago, I think it was about a year ago, on my blog, I have a video of a team in either Macau or the Philippines that was doing this on Baccarat, and the guy had something in his thumbnail, and he would use the cut card to mask it, and he would travel down the entire length of the Baccarat shoe, riffling it just like what you're talking about with the camera in his sleeve, and get a whole baccarat shoe that way.
Yeah.
And if you and no evidence afterwards, it's just
nothing at all.
Yeah. Well, nowadays that means jail time. So
I would think so. At the time, was the Ultimate Edge illegal, or was it clear if it was legal or not? Or
it's always a question. It's like my guess is it almost certainly was, but what happened was
it was legal. It
was probably almost certainly illegal. Okay, but what happened was one of the members of the team was. Basically, it was a case of as you can't even imagine such a thing would happen, but there was a case of mistaken identity. He was actually backroomed in Tahoe and beaten up because they thought he was somebody else. And when they realized, and bear in mind, this individual happened to be a blackjack player, but he could have been anybody at all. He could have been anybody at all. He didn't necessarily have to be an advantaged player. And so what happened was when they realized they had beaten up the wrong person, they arrested him and charged him with assaulting security guards and possession of burglary tools and a number of other charges. The idea was that they would charge him with all these crimes, and then they would basically say, we won't press charges if you don't press charges against us for beating you up. And it was something snapped at that point, because prior to that there's something about, and I'm assuming that a number of listeners can really understand this. There's something about coming up with an idea about how to beat the game, right? You come up with this idea. You come up with an idea of getting the whole card, or the slicing and dicing, right? Cutting the bottom card to the dealer, or the shuffle tracking, or whatever. And the greatest thing about this is the casinos offer the game. They set the rules. They set the number of decks. They decide whether they're going to hit soft 17 or stand on it. It's all them. And then we say, okay, we'll play. And if we come up with an idea that works, we win. And if we come up with an idea that doesn't match reality, right? That doesn't like betting on your birthday or something, we lose.
That doesn't work.
And it's perfect. Right. If you come up with a system that doesn't actually map properly onto the underlying reality of the way the world works, you lose. You don't hurt anybody else. You just lose. And that's the way it should be. It's exactly the way the world should work. Yeah. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. What happened here was, we were doing something. We got an edge. It was completely legal what we were doing. And nonetheless, this person was beaten up. And then, again, when they realized what they did, they charged him with these crimes. And it's just incredibly unfair. And so at that point, I think we all kind of decided, okay, well, the gloves are off.
Well, it's funny because that's exactly the words that Keith Taft used to me. The gloves came off. Because
Keith Taft has this computer program, David.
Well, Keith Taft not only also designed a shuffle tracking computer, he did the first counting computers, and he did it. But he also the video stuff there was no law making it illegal until Keith's brother-in-law got busted at the marina here in Las Vegas with a belt buckle camera. And at that point, that's when the casinos kind of freaked out and said, we have to make this illegal. And that's when it was really because of the video, not so much the computers, that really brought in that law that changed in July of '85.
Yeah, the thing about that is that what happened was they had been pulled up for the computers long before that, in the late 70s, as a matter of fact, I believe, right, in Tahoe. And what happened was they determined the computers aren't doing anything other than what you can already do in your brain, and so therefore they're not an illegal device. They're not giving you an advantage that you couldn't get using your brain. And so what Keith's assumption was, well, if that's the case with the computers, then the camera is doing the exact same thing, except it's replacing your eye. In other words, if the dealer doesn't expose the whole card, a camera can't see it, an eye can't see it, nothing can see it. In other words, they're exposing the card, and if a computer is simply an extension of your brain, then a camera is simply an extension of your eye. But it turned out that they wound up getting arrested and going to jail, as it turns out.
Well, yeah, his brother-in-law, I think, did 90 days or 6 months, even though there was no law against it at the time. But that's when they ended up writing the law. And even that was a mistaken, there was a bomb threat at the marina, and the security guards happened to hear some guys in the back of a truck talking and opened the doors, and,
and the guy was sitting there in his underwear.
I won't ask you what he was doing. Now, Mark, do you feel like your team caused laws to change in Nevada and elsewhere? And if so, do you feel like you made a difference in the world in the 80s?
Well, I don't know about any laws. I mean, the computer law, there was probably a combination of reasons for that. I think Munchkin has touched on the most important one was what happened there. But the fact that that we built computers, other people built computers, I think we might have something to do with that. I will say that certainly the little viewer, the little device that looks at the hole card, was almost certainly a direct result of us and other people who were working at the time. They no longer peak underneath tens, and I don't know if that makes things better necessarily. They certainly make things different. So, one of the things about the device law was when it, in its original written form, it specifically referred to card games. And unfortunately, right around that time, the Eudaimonic Pie was published, which was a book about these individuals who had built computers to play roulette. And so they got rid of the word cards, because had that law been passed, computers would have been prohibited only on games that involved cards. That's kind of how loosely they were writing laws back then. They weren't very careful about it. So had that book simply been published a year later, the roulette computers, well, who knows? I'm sure they would have rewritten it anyway, but we might have been able to play.
Might have had a better device law.
Yes.
Bob Nersessian seems to think that the device law that currently exists in Nevada is rather flawed.
Oh, it's clearly unconstitutionally vague. Yeah, there's no way to read a law and say, okay, I've read the law and I understand what I'm thinking of doing is A, legal, or B, illegal. You can't tell. What really happens, and I actually have this in the book, what really happens is you think of something, you go out and do it, you get arrested, maybe beat up a little bit, charged with some crimes, and you go in front of a judge, and maybe you'll be found guilty and maybe you won't. But there's no way to know beforehand whether what you're doing violates that law or not. I mean, there's a good argument to be made that a pen and a piece of paper violate that law. They conceivably could, very easily. It's very poorly written.
Hopefully, video poker strategy cards are not added to that list.
But there's debate about that.
The point is, exactly right. There's no way to know until somebody gets pulled up and dragged in front of a judge. That's what's wrong with the law. You're supposed to know beforehand you can't go more than 55 miles an hour, not after.
I found tonight's very interesting. Thank you, Mark. It was. We recommend the book, The Ultimate Edge, Professional Blackjack in the 1980s. Munchkin, you lived this, so you weren't a character in the book, but you were. So it must have been deja vu all over again, kind of for you.
It really was. It really was. And as you said, I recognized right away specifically who the people in the book were, just because it was such a small world back then. There just weren't that many players.
Although recognizing composite people, I'm kind of wondering how you did that.
Well, I mean, the story about the guy who takes his shoes, and the and the bust almost happening. Actually, the way I had heard the story, you know how stories change over the years. I had heard that he did go back and that got busted, but the red light, green light. I mean, that didn't happen to more than one group of people.
I'll bet. All right, very good. The South Point has more than 10,000 video poker games, returning more than 99%. That's more than anybody else. During the month of April, every Sunday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you get a free swipe if you earn 200 same-day points. Swipes can range from 2,500 points, which is worth $7.50, through either $20 or $50 in free play, including a possible 2 times points until midnight, which, if you're a big player, is by far the most valuable thing you can earn. The swipes are random, but they're not equally weighted. In past drawings of this general nature, if you get big mailers, you tended to get the $50 free play almost all the time. If you were just a new sign-up, you tended to get 2,500 points or a free breakfast buffet. You could earn, it was a variation, but it is definitely weighted. Double point days in April are every Monday, midnight to midnight, no limits. The free video poker class this noon at the South Point in the showroom is called Secrets of a Video Poker Winner. The class covers such things as which game is best for you, money management, dealing with the IRS, and traits winning players have in common with each other. At the Palms, the Friday and Saturday night drawings in April are called the $80,000 cash and free slot play drawing. Each night, or each Friday and Saturday nights, 4 of each, 10 winners will receive money ranging from a bottom prize of $300 cash plus $300 in free play up to a top prize of $1,000 in cash and $1,000 in free play. The drawings are at 8 p.m. based on virtual entries earned since 8 p.m. the previous Saturday. On Friday and Saturday nights between 8 p.m. and midnight, you earn 3 times drawing entries. The Monday, Wednesday, Friday PEW, Play, Earn, and Win, gifts for the first half of the month will have a theme of jewelry and more. Far more interesting than the jewelry that's offered, which includes bracelets, earrings, that kind of thing, are Visa cards. You can earn a $100 Visa card for 40,000 video poker points, or $50 Visa card for 20,000 video poker points. So that is at a 0.25% rate, which makes it effectively double points. If you earn them on slot machines, you're earning them at a 2% rate. There are some slot machines with progressives there. If you're clever enough to be able to figure that out, earning the Visa cards on the slot machines can be a profitable play. This is the first time you can extend your points over multiple days. In the past, if you wanted, you had to spend your play earner points the same day you earn it. Today, on a Monday, for example, if you earned 180,000 points, you could spend 60 on Monday, 60 on Wednesday, 60 on Friday. At the end of Friday, they all disappear until the next week. At videopoker.com, we frequently talk about the monthly contests. They normally run the last 7 or 8 days of the month. The one for April hasn't been announced yet. They also have daily contests with smaller prizes, but prizes nonetheless, which introduce you to games that you might not be familiar with. Today, until midnight, assuming you're listening to this live on April 4th, the daily contest is Wheel Poker. The next 3 days, the contest will be Ultimate 4 of a Kind, Super Triple Play Poker, and Multi-Strike. In various parts of the country, these games are the best games available. Some people would rather practice for free to figure out how the games go, and that way when they go to the casino, they know pretty much what they're up to. Our guest next week will be poker and blackjack player Kat Hulbert, author of Outplaying the Boys, Poker Tips for Competitive Women. Munch, she was in your book. What do you know about Kathy?
Well, to me, she was the most interesting interview in my book. In addition to playing professional blackjack and poker, she also ran one of the very first slot machine teams. You know, she had little old ladies on Social Security working for her, pulling slot handles back 25 years ago or whatever. So 2 things I think are really interesting. One is the whole female perspective. Women get treated differently both in the blackjack world and the poker world in the casinos. And the other thing is the difference between blackjack players and poker players. They are really different types of gamblers and different types of people.
Which one is video poker players closest to?
They're more like blackjack players.
I don't know if it to be insulted or complimented. Okay. In 2 weeks, we're going to have gaming analyst Ken Adams. Ken regularly writes on a variety of gambling topics, and he's always an interesting listen. And in 3 weeks, our guest will be Nolan Dalla, talking about this year's upcoming World Series of Poker. So that's our upcoming. So we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to throw another question back at Mark. In general, how is blackjack different today than it was in the good old days?
It's much, much different now. There are many, many differences. There's, we talked about the fact that they don't peek under. Well, they use a little peeker to look under the card. The biggest difference, I think, is that And also bear in mind that there were many, many, many single deck games when I first started, and now there's very few of those left, and those that are around, a lot of 6-5 payouts for blackjack, things like that. But I think the biggest difference is just the fact that pretty much everybody now knows what card counting is and what it looks like. I mean, there's there's been books, there's been movies, there's been articles, there's the Discovery Channel thing, right, that explains how all of this stuff works. And it's very hard for me to imagine that anybody who works in a casino knows nothing about it. Back then, it was very, very rare certainly for dealers to know how this worked. I do know that after maybe by the mid 80s, the dealers would kind of recognize that people were changing their bets. As a matter of fact, we did this thing. Again, they couldn't keep track themselves, but if they recognized a particular behavior, like whenever this guy raises his bet, it looks like maybe small cards came out. What we started to do was we would start out by betting maybe 100 or 200 a hand, and if the count went up, we would just continue to bet 100 or 200, and if it went down, we would raise our bet. And the dealer would take that as a signal that the count must be good and would automatically shuffle. So that kind of thing, I seriously doubt would ever work nowadays. There's much more knowledge on the part of the casinos now.
They won't shuffle up if you raise your bet. I mean, it would still, if they're not tracking, I would still
now they
think
would just back you off right away.
Yeah.
So
they wouldn't bother with the shuffle up. They would just back you off. I mean, Mark is right. The knowledge of the casino is much more. I can't tell you how many bosses back then said to me, "Oh, well, nobody can count a shoe." Right. If you could spread all you wanted on the shoe games, they knew that card counters played the single deck. But the biggest difference is there were only two places to play: Nevada and Atlantic City. And
in
now,
the United States.
In the United States. And now there are casinos everywhere. So, so really it's gotten better in a way because there are so many more places to play. Yes, they're much smarter, and they communicate way better. I mean, back then, you'd get barred on swing shift and just go back in the next day on day shift. They didn't have photographs of you. There was no communication. And now, your picture gets disseminated instantly all over town. So,
but the fact that there are so many different places to play, let's say there's 1,000 casinos, the expertise to run 1,000 different casinos can't be out there. So there's got to be a lot of bad pit critters that you can take advantage of.
That's true. And the other thing is, back then, pit bosses knew something about protecting the games. Maybe they didn't understand card counting, but a lot of them just knew when you were up to something. Whereas now they're basically glorified clerks. They're busy keeping track of your average bet and how much you bought in, and they don't know anything about the games. A lot of them, they're doing paperwork.
Would you say the same? Are dealers more knowledgeable now too about advantage play, or?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Mark, do you have any experience? Or do you play at all?
Not very much. No, I do play some roulette. I played a little bit of blackjack, but not very much. But I would say that they, even if they're not looking out for it, they're certainly aware of it. They're much more aware of it. I mean, early on, it was very clear that there were most of the dealers had no idea that it even existed.
That's interesting. So, can you still make a living playing blackjack today?
I would think so, yeah.
The guys who are counting cards, there are very few people who just make a living counting cards, but the ones who do live out of a suitcase. They get barred, they drive to the next state. I mean, they're just constantly on the road, and there's so many casinos, they can just continue to do that.
And there are other techniques that we haven't talked about today that you can take advantage of in blackjack games, and those still currently exist.
Yes.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much, Mark Billings. Interesting read. Everybody go out and hit lots of royal flushes. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
You've been listening to Gambling with an Edge with your hosts, Bob Dancer and Richard Munchkin. Subscribe to the show in iTunes, and episodes will be delivered to you automatically every week. Archived versions of past shows may be found at bobdancer.com and richardmunchkin.com. We welcome emails at gamblingwithanedge@gmail.com. Bob Dancer and Richard Munchkin are both available on Facebook and welcome your questions. The sponsors for the show are the South Point Hotel, Casino and Spa, the M Resort, the Palms Casino Resort, and the website videopoker.com. Join us again next week for another Gambling with an Edge.